It's December 25th, 1914, 5 months after the start of the First World War between the Entente and Central Powers of Europe. Trenches had already been dug up, and thousands of soldiers had already died. Yet in the early morning hours of Christmas Day, no fighting commenced, and no bullets were fired. While sitting in their trenches, British men soon began to hear the sound of German soldiers approaching. However, instead of coming with weaponry or machinery, these soldiers came empty-handed, and, with their arms up, were singing Silent Night in both English and German. Thus, for one day of World War I, British and German soldiers on the Western Front put aside their differences and celebrated together in brotherhood in no man's land, exchanging gifts and food and playing football. This beautiful and harmonious peace only lasted for one day, as after Christmas, everyone returned to their trenches and on the 27th began fighting and killing people who they had just made friends with the day before. The war from there continued as it normally did. There were no more Christmas truces after 1914, and commanding officers on both sides made sure that any support for a peaceful meet-up with the enemy was suppressed. The war ended roughly 4 years after the truce, with Germany and the Central Powers losing. The Treaty of Versailles, blah blah blah, you get the gist. Today, World War I as a whole is viewed as one of the most tragic conflicts in human history, with millions of people dying. It left such a mark on the events of the 20th century and shaped how we live in the modern day, not always in a good way. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate universe, the Christmas truce resulted in the ceasing of all fighting on the Western Front and eventually the end of the First World War altogether? As Christmas is coming up soon, today I'll be doing a more festive scenario of what if the Christmas truce ended World War I. This scenario's point of divergence is quite simple. After the Christmas truce, the soldiers on both sides merely have to dig their heels in, ignore their commander's orders, and refuse to fight, under the argument that it's immoral to kill actual breathing human beings, especially ones who you would come to know and form friendships with. Now, normally when a soldier in the First World War refused to take their commander's orders, they would be imprisoned or executed by the firing squad. However, this time, the amount of soldiers refusing to fight greatly outnumbers the commanders ordering them to do so. The incompetent commanders in power would at first not take this soldier mutiny lightly, and arrests and executions would take place. Eventually, though, they would give up. The soldiers, at least the German ones, would pack up and leave the trenches on the Western Front, and after some last pushes by the French and Belgian armies, diplomats would be brought in to negotiate a Western Front ceasefire. There would be some minor concessions and agreements made by both sides, such as returning or exchanging colonies, and Germany pulling out of France and Belgium, and possibly Alsace-Lorraine. However, the war wouldn't have lasted long enough for anything drastic to change, so there wouldn't be any clear winners. It would be mostly a draw. The end of fighting in the West would not mean the end of fighting on the Eastern Front, however. With Germany no longer fighting a war on two fronts, they, along with Austro-Hungary, can now direct most of their military attention to Russia. This would end disastrously for the Russians, and by late February of 1915, Russia would surrender and a peace would be negotiated, with something similar to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty being signed, ending the war early and making the short war illusion and the over-by-Christmas theory a reality. World War I would have only lasted 7 months, and thus I guess it would be thought of and named differently. Maybe it would be called something like the 7 Months War or the War of 1914, and not necessarily the Great War. After some time, it would be remembered merely as a brief military European spat. Going out of the war, everyone would view the result as basically a draw, with Russia acting as the de facto loser. Japan doesn't change much, war or no war, as usual. With Russia humiliated, there would be a revolution like in our timeline. However, it would probably be a Republican one, not a communist one, as Lenin wouldn't have been sent back to Russia by the Germans and would have likely stayed in Switzerland for most of his life. Without communism, the new Russian Republic would probably evolve into somewhat of a fascist, isolationist dictatorship. With the war not being able to technologically escalate and show its true destructive colors, this would mean that the European empires would be much more stable going into the 20s, and especially with Germany basically subduing Russia, Britain and France would be more strict on holding on to their colonies. The end of the war would not mean the end of mistrust among the European nations, and the Christmas peace wouldn't automatically prevent any more conflict between them. In fact, a new larger war in Europe sometime in the 1920s or 30s is nearly inevitable in a circumstance like this, except it's unknown how it would start and play out, as Hitler wouldn't have risen to power, the German Kaiser would have remained on the throne, and the Soviet Union wouldn't exist. The British and French population would also begin to get restless right after the war, as all their nationalistic and jingoistic desires they wanted out of it would not be met. They would never have seen the horrifying invention and use of the tank or the U-boat, and thus a new war may still be favorable to them. In a way, if the Christmas truce ended World War I, it wouldn't necessarily end it, it would just pause it, and World War I Part 2 would maybe happen a decade later. As for the US, without entering into a war on the side of the already battered Allied powers, they wouldn't be as powerful going into the 20s, and would also have more competition from a still thriving British Empire, and may struggle to gain its economic foothold on the world. Instead, they would stay isolationist, as usual, with Britain and Germany continuing to rule the waves. In this universe, I don't see Austro-Hungary living past 1930. Their government system was nowhere near strong enough to handle the large amount of ethnicities within their borders. I'd say by around 1925-ish, some smaller states would begin to break away, and eventually the empire would collapse altogether, unless the Austrians managed to somehow confederalize, which may delay their downfall by a couple of decades. But still, Austro-Hungary's days were always numbered. As for the Ottomans, they would hold on to what was left of their empire for quite some time, definitely much longer than in our universe, but that doesn't mean they'd survive to the modern day. Fascism would probably still rise in Italy, China would still break apart, and Japan would still invade East Asia. However, communism would not take off in this timeline. Speaking of Japan, the Pacific War would probably still happen in the 1940s, just only between the US, Britain, France, and the Japanese Empire, and it wouldn't escalate into a world war. It would be after this war that the US would begin to gain some economic and military momentum. What goes on after the 1950s, I'm not really clear, which is why I'm going to end this video here and leave it up to your imagination. Thank you all for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and suggest your own scenarios for 2023 in the comments if you have any. And of course, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. See ya!